The tension that erupted on Capitol Hill this week did not appear out of thin air. It was the visible climax of months, if not years, of accumulated frustration between opposing factions of American governance, exacerbated by ideological rigidity and the growing influence of partisan spectacle. As the federal government entered its 8th consecutive day of shutdown, the halls of Congress became not only the site of legislative paralysis, but also a theater of confrontation, revealing how personal rivalries and constitutional interpretations now drive political behavior as much as policy itself. The face-off between House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries and Republican Representative Lawler encapsulated the larger dysfunction, a dispute ostensibly over the Affordable Care Act, ACA, extension, but, more deeply, about the legitimacy of compromise in an era defined by loyalty tests and media optics. At the heart of this confrontation lies a seemingly procedural matter, the renewal of federal subsidies under the ACA. Lawler, breaking from much of his party's leadership, approached Jeffries in a hallway after a Democratic press conference and pressed for an immediate one-year extension of ACA tax credits, arguing that it would provide relief to millions of Americans and temporarily stabilize the healthcare system amid the shutdown. Jeffries, however, rejected what he called a band-aid solution, insisting that Democrats would only support a permanent renewal of the tax relief provisions that have become a lifeline for working-class families. What should have been a technical policy discussion swiftly deteriorated into a personal verbal duel. "Did you get permission from your boss?" Jeffries asked, a barbed reference to Donald Trump's continuing influence over Republican decision-making. "Has he given you the go-ahead?" Lawler fired back that the Democratic leader was politicizing a crisis. Moments later, Jeffries snapped, "Why don't you just shut your mouth?" A line that instantly traveled across news networks and social media, capturing the raw emotion of a Congress held hostage by its own divisions. The substance of their disagreement, temporary versus permanent relief, was almost secondary to what it symbolized. The ACA debate has long served as a proxy for the broader philosophical divide between parties. Democrats view healthcare as a public right, Republicans as a market-driven commodity. Yet this specific exchange underscored an additional fracture within the GOP itself. Lawler's pragmatic appeal for a short-term compromise contrasted sharply with the hardline stance of Speaker Mike Johnson, who refused to bring even a limited funding bill to the floor without securing deeper spending cuts and policy concessions. Johnson's position aligned closely with Trump's calls to use the shutdown as leverage, portraying it as a necessary stand against fiscal irresponsibility and socialized medicine. When Jeffries accused Lawler of acting under Trump's orders, he was not merely taunting him, he was identifying the invisible chain of command that continues to dictate Republican behavior even after Trump's departure from office. The episode also highlighted the shifting power dynamics between the House and Senate. While the upper chamber attempted unsuccessfully for the 6th time to advance a bipartisan spending package, Johnson's House remained paralyzed. Outside the Speaker's office, Senators Mark Kelly and Ruben Gallego confronted Johnson directly, demanding to know why he had delayed the swearing-in of Representative-elect Adelita Grijalva, whose vote would have created the 218-member threshold needed to force a discharge petition on the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. The senators accused Johnson of using procedural tactics to block oversight and accountability, linking his inaction to a culture of institutional evasion. Johnson denied any connection between the delay and the Epstein issue, calling the accusation ridiculous. Gallego retorted that it was the longest period in modern history for a member-elect not to be sworn in, implicitly suggesting that partisan motives had overridden democratic norms. The exchange was emblematic of how even administrative formalities have become battlefields for political control. In the corridors of power, where public performance and private negotiation used to coexist in a delicate balance, the performative dimension now dominates. Every argument, every offhand insult, every raised voice is recorded, dissected, and repurposed for partisan gain. Jeffries' "shut-your-mouth" remark and Lawler's sarcastic, "Is that how you talk?" were not only expressions of irritation, they were instant soundbites designed to mobilize outrage, energize donors, and reinforce tribal identities. The government may have been shut down, but the machinery of political branding was running at full speed. Both sides understood that the real audience was not each other, it was the electorate, watching from home, angry, anxious, and increasingly cynical. To understand the gravity of this confrontation, it is essential to situate it within the constitutional mechanics of a shutdown. Under Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution, no funds may be drawn from the Treasury without congressional appropriation. When Congress fails to pass a funding bill, federal operations halt, affecting hundreds of thousands of workers and suspending countless services. Historically, such impasses have been resolved through negotiation and compromise. But in the current climate, compromise is equated with weakness. The ACA extension became the latest hostage in a pattern where essential governance functions are subordinated to ideological purity tests. The result is a government unable to perform its most basic duty, sustaining itself. The contrast between the principal actors is stark not only in policy, but in temperament. Jeffries, a former litigator known for his meticulous discipline and rhetorical precision, represents the institutionalist tradition of the Democratic Party, structured, procedural, and deeply rooted in the language of fairness and equity. Lawler, by contrast, embodies the pragmatic suburban Republican trying to navigate between party orthodoxy and the expectations of a moderate constituency. His willingness to engage Democrats on health care marked him as an outlier within his caucus, which explains both Jeffries' skepticism and Lawler's defensiveness. The encounter between them was therefore less about ideology than about survival. Jeffries defending his party's coherence amid internal pressure, Lawler defending his autonomy against accusations of submission to Trump. Meanwhile, Speaker Mike Johnson's exchanges with Senators Kelly and Gallego revealed another layer of conflict, the tension between procedural control and moral accountability. When pressed about the delayed swearing-in of Grijalva, Johnson framed his response in terms of institutional protocol, citing tradition and process. But Gallego's rebuttal cut deeper, implying that procedure had become a convenient cloak for manipulation. The subtext was unmistakable. Johnson's invocation of rules was not about governance but about obstruction. In that sense, the Senate-House confrontation mirrored the broader struggle within American politics between those who view institutions as tools for accountability and those who use them as shields for partisanship. These dueling interpretations of duty, procedural versus moral, reflect an even more profound divide over the meaning of constitutional responsibility. To Jeffries and the Senate Democrats, constitutional duty entails ensuring the continuity of government and protecting citizens' welfare. To Johnson and his allies, it means resisting what they perceive as executive overreach and safeguarding fiscal integrity, even at the cost of temporary dysfunction. Both invoke the Constitution, yet they operate from incompatible frameworks of legitimacy. The shutdown thus becomes not merely a fiscal standoff but an existential contest over what it means to govern under a shared charter. Adding to the intensity is the erosion of personal restraint within the political class. The Capitol, once governed by a code of decorum and implicit respect across the aisle, now resembles a perpetual campaign arena. The personal invective exchange between Jeffries and Lawler, culminating in the now famous "shut your mouth" retort, demonstrates how civility has been replaced by performance. Lawler's rejoinder, "Is that how you talk?" captured the incredulity of an era where rhetorical aggression is both condemned and rewarded. The incident is symptomatic of what scholars call performative polarization, in which the incentives for cooperation are structurally weaker than those for confrontation. In such an environment, even the most minor disagreements can escalate into moral crises. This decline in institutional civility also mirrors broader societal trends. The public, increasingly fragmented along partisan and informational lines, demands authenticity expressed through anger rather than reason. Politicians respond in kind, equating volume with conviction. The image of Jeffries pointing a finger in the hallway, Lawler retorting in disbelief, Johnson sparring with senators in front of cameras, all of it forms part of a continuous feedback loop where outrage fuels relevance. The political ecosystem now rewards the loudest voice, not the most persuasive argument. Yet beneath the noise lies a substantive question about the purpose of governance. If lawmakers cannot maintain the basic function of keeping the government open, what does representation mean? The shutdown, extending into its second week, had already halted Medicare telehealth appointments, delayed paychecks for federal employees, and threatened national infrastructure maintenance. The longer it persisted, the more apparent it became that partisan brinkmanship had replaced stewardship. For Jeffries, this was proof of Republican irresponsibility. For Johnson, it was evidence that Democrats preferred dependency over discipline. Each side claimed constitutional righteousness, yet both contributed to public disillusionment. The contrasting leadership styles of Jeffries and Johnson also illuminate the evolving character of American political identity. Jeffries projects himself as a rational reformer, fluent in the language of institutional continuity. Johnson, by contrast, casts himself as a moral guardian, invoking faith and tradition as guiding principles. Their interaction with figures like Lawler, Kelly, and Gallego creates a mosaic of competing generational and ideological identities: the legalist, the loyalist, the reformer, the populist. The Capitol confrontations compressed these identities into a single, chaotic tableau that revealed more about the state of American democracy than any policy paper could. The irony is that everyone involved claimed to be acting in defense of the same Constitution, yet their interpretations of that document have drifted so far apart that dialogue itself becomes untenable. The Constitution, once a shared grammar of governance, has turned into a mirror reflecting partisan belief systems. For Jeffries, its spirit demands proactive protection of citizens' rights. For Johnson, it imposes restraint on government power. For Lawler, it offers pragmatic flexibility. For Kelly and Gallego, it embodies accountability through transparency. When such divergent readings collide without a shared interpretive framework, confrontation becomes inevitable and compromise impossible. Ultimately, the confrontation in the Capitol's marble hallways was more than a clash of tempers. It was the physical manifestation of an intellectual and constitutional crisis. The government shutdown provided the immediate context, but the deeper conflict concerns legitimacy. Who has the right to define governance, to interpret the Constitution, to claim moral high ground? Jeffries' "shut your mouth" was less an insult than an expression of exasperation at what he perceives as the erosion of good faith argument. Lawler's offended reply symbolized a generation of politicians caught between loyalty to principle and loyalty to power. Together, their exchange distilled the paralysis of modern American politics, a system where speaking out and staying silent are both condemned, and where every word becomes a weapon. If the hallway confrontation between Hakeem Jeffries and Mike Lawler dramatized the emotional fatigue of Congress, the deeper story unfolded behind closed doors in the committees, the briefing memos, and the policy documents that became ammunition in a larger constitutional war. Within that battlefield, one rhetorical weapon began to dominate the discourse: the brought the receipts strategy. This modern political idiom, once confined to online debates, now defined the language of oversight and impeachment proceedings in Washington. It refers to the act of producing incontrovertible evidence, written records, procedural notes, financial audits, or legal correspondences to publicly dismantle an opponent's narrative. The phrase gained renewed traction as members of Congress sought to prove, not merely argue, their moral and constitutional legitimacy amid the chaos of the shutdown. In the days following the "shut your mouth" episode, Jeffries and his Democratic allies shifted focus from verbal confrontation to documentary demonstration. Rather than debating hypotheticals about responsibility for the shutdown, they began circulating committee reports and CBO, Congressional Budget Office, analyses showing how the Republican refusal to extend ACA subsidies would cost working families billions in healthcare premiums. These were not abstract arguments. They were line-by-line breakdowns of data and funding loss projections, handed out to reporters and members on both sides of the aisle. By doing so, Jeffries symbolically brought the receipts, transforming a shouting match into a contest of proof. His intent was not just to win the news cycle, but to reclaim the moral authority of evidence in an era dominated by emotion and misinformation. The Republican response was more fragmented. Speaker Mike Johnson attempted to counter the Democratic offensive by releasing his own set of documents, letters from conservative think tanks, internal caucus memos, and legal opinions arguing that the temporary extension of ACA credits violated the principles of fiscal discipline. However, these materials lacked the immediacy and clarity of the Democratic data, relying instead on interpretive claims rather than empirical evidence. While Democrats wielded the language of policy, Republicans leaned on the language of principle. Both invoked the Constitution, but with different emphases. Democrats framed the spending authority under the General Welfare Clause, while Johnson's faction cited Article 1, Section 8, as a limit on congressional largesse. Thus, The receipts themselves became partisan instruments, reflecting two incompatible visions of what proof even means in modern governance. Nowhere was this epistemic divide more visible than in the House Judiciary and Oversight Committees, which had become staging grounds for a renewed debate over the impeachment of President Biden. Though the shutdown ostensibly centered on budgetary gridlock, the undercurrent of impeachment politics ran through every committee hearing. Johnson's allies argued that the president's alleged misuse of executive authority over border funding justified renewed inquiry, while Democrats dismissed the hearings as a distraction from the urgent need to reopen the government. Jeffries, in one of his most pointed remarks, told reporters, "We are legislating under siege by conspiracy, not by law." He then distributed a packet of legal precedents dating back to the 1974 Nixon impeachment and the 1998 Clinton proceedings, each highlighting Congress's constitutional obligation to separate oversight from obstruction. In effect, he brought historical receipts to challenge the moral coherence of the impeachment effort. The use of "brought the receipts" as a governing strategy signaled a transformation in political rhetoric from persuasion to verification. In earlier decades, congressional argumentation relied on ethos and pathos, moral authority and emotional appeal. But in an era when every assertion is fact-checked, weaponized, and repackaged for social media, lawmakers now compete to produce the most screenshotable evidence. The shutdown hearings became a theater of documents. Folders raised in the air, PDFs leaked to journalists, footnotes turned into talking points. When Senator Ruben Gallego confronted Speaker Johnson over the delayed swearing-in of Representative-elect Grijalva, he too invoked documentary evidence, the congressional record, dated precedents, and procedural calendars proving that the delay was without justification. Johnson's denial that the delay was merely process could not erase the visual impact of Gallego holding up the printed pages on live television. The gesture was symbolic but potent. Proof had become performance. To understand why this strategy resonates so powerfully, one must consider the collapse of epistemic trust in American politics. For much of the 21st century, partisan echo chambers have eroded the authority of facts themselves. Data is no longer persuasive unless it aligns with pre-existing beliefs. In such an environment, bringing the receipts functions not only as an appeal to truth but also as an assertion of credibility, a way to say, "My evidence is more real than yours." It is a contest of verification, a struggle to define what counts as reality within a post-truth political culture. By circulating documents instead of slogans, Jeffries and his allies sought to re-establish a hierarchy of authority based on verifiable sources. Yet this also reinforced polarization. Each side curated its own receipts, its own facts, its own version of constitutional fidelity. The impeachment dimension magnified these tensions. Johnson's caucus, already under pressure from far-right members demanding action against the president, attempted to link the shutdown to a broader narrative of executive overreach. Their argument was that the White House's management of healthcare funds and immigration policy represented a pattern of unconstitutional spending, thereby justifying impeachment proceedings. The irony, of course, was that the shutdown itself, triggered by Congress's refusal to fund basic government functions, became the very proof Democrats used to argue that Republicans were sabotaging governance in order to manufacture grounds for impeachment. Once again, each side brought the receipts, but the receipts told opposite stories. In several late-night hearings, Democratic counsel presented excerpts from the 2019 GAO, Government Accountability Office, report on executive spending authority, demonstrating that the president's actions fell within statutory limits. Meanwhile, Johnson's allies introduced internal correspondence suggesting that White House officials had circumvented certain committee notifications. The hearings devolved into a procedural tug-of-war, not about truth, but about interpretive control. The language of evidence, citations, exhibits, references, became a rhetorical mask for power. The act of bringing the receipts was no longer about illumination, it was about dominance. Yet amidst this evidentiary arms race, a subtle shift occurred in how the public perceived congressional legitimacy. Polling conducted during the second week of the shutdown showed a marked increase in support for fact-based communication and bipartisan documentation initiatives. Independent voters, weary of partisan slogans, responded positively to legislators who cited data rather than delivering sound bites. This reaction validated Jeffries' approach, which fused moral outrage with empirical rigor. His refrain, "We legislate with evidence, not emotion," became a rallying cry for Democrats seeking to contrast their methods with what they portrayed as the GOP's reliance on ideology and improvisation. But the strategy was not without risks. By centering discourse on documentation, Jeffries and his colleagues inadvertently reinforced the perception that politics had become a technocratic elite exercise, a realm of policy wonks trading white papers, while ordinary citizens suffered the material consequences of the shutdown. Republicans exploited this perception skillfully. Mike Lawler, despite being the target of Jeffries' outburst, framed himself as the populist underdog fighting against bureaucratic obstruction. "You can throw all the papers you want," he told Fox News, "but people can't buy groceries with policy memos." His words resonated with voters who equated evidence with detachment. Thus, the brought the receipts strategy, while intellectually superior, risked alienating the very audience it sought to persuade. This tension between empirical legitimacy and emotional resonance lies at the heart of modern political persuasion. Lawmakers like Jeffries embody the technocratic ideal of reasoned governance, but their opponents understand that outrage often outperforms evidence in the attention economy. Speaker Johnson, though repeatedly fact-checked and contradicted, knew that his base valued conviction over consistency in this asymmetrical information war. The side that brings the receipts must also translate them into moral narrative, a story of justice, betrayal, or redemption that citizens can feel, not just verify. Without that narrative bridge, even the most damning evidence can dissipate in the noise. The impeachment hearings crystallized this dilemma. When presented with constitutional analysis showing that no impeachable offense had occurred, Johnson's allies simply reframed the debate. The issue was no longer legality but trust. Did Americans trust the president? Did they trust Congress? Did they trust the system itself? By reframing impeachment as an emotional referendum rather than a legal one, Republicans sidestepped the evidentiary terrain entirely. This rhetorical pivot undermined the very logic of the receipts strategy, revealing that in contemporary politics, the battle over truth is often secondary to the battle over belief. Yet, ironically, this same dynamic allowed the brought the receipts approach to expose hypocrisy. When documents surfaced showing that several Republican lawmakers had privately supported the same ACA subsidies they now denounced, the contradiction was undeniable. Jeffries seized upon these internal memos, quoting them line by line in a press briefing that went viral. "They say one thing in the room and another in the chamber," he declared, holding the pages aloft. The phrase, "brought the receipts," trended across social media, not as slang but as a symbol of accountability. The visual of printed evidence, tangible, physical, undeniable, became an antidote to the ephemeral nature of digital disinformation. What made this moment distinct was not the existence of evidence, but its public performance. The congressional theater of receipts was both a legal and cultural ritual, affirming that truth in a democracy must be seen to exist. The very act of displaying documents, waving them, reading them aloud, uploading them to official feeds functioned as a political exorcism against denialism. But the deeper question remained: can democracy survive when proof itself becomes partisan property? If both sides bring their own receipts, whose truth prevails? From a constitutional perspective, the brought the receipts strategy reaffirms an old but fading principle that governance must rest on demonstrable fact, not conjecture. During the Nixon and Clinton impeachments, evidence collection was laborious and procedural, but it was also unifying a shared commitment to documentation as the measure of legitimacy. Today, that unity has splintered. Evidence is filtered through ideology before it even reaches the public. The shutdown hearings revealed how far this fragmentation has gone. Both parties wielded the same constitutional text, but read it as if from different religions. Article 2's faithful execution clause became, simultaneously, a defense of executive discretion and a charge of executive abuse. In that sense, bringing the receipts no longer settles disputes, it multiplies them. Still, the persistence of this strategy suggests that the impulse toward verification has not entirely vanished. Beneath the noise, there remains a hunger among journalists, citizens, and some legislators for documentation that outlasts rhetoric. The printed page, the archive file, the official transcript, These artifacts continue to anchor democracy against the drift of opinion. When Jeffries held up his binder of reports, when Gallego cited procedural precedent, when Kelly quoted statutory text, they were participating in an older tradition of Republican accountability. To bring the receipts was to declare faith not in the spectacle, but in the record. Ultimately, the impeachment debate within the context of the shutdown revealed the paradox of modern evidence politics. Facts can be both weapon and shield, both revelation and distraction. By invoking the receipts, Democrats reclaimed moral high ground in the short term, but the underlying structural cynicism remained untouched. Proof could expose hypocrisy, but it could not restore trust. The public, bombarded with contradictory receipts from both sides, began to view all documentation as partisan theater. And yet, paradoxically, it was precisely this theatricality, the image of lawmakers drowning in paperwork, that reminded the nation of what Congress is supposed to be, a forum where argument must rest on record, not rumor. In that regard, the brought the receipts strategy, for all its limitations, represented a fragile victory for constitutional rationality. Amid a government paralyzed by spectacle, it was a rare gesture towards substance. Whether wielded in the service of impeachment or policy defense, the act of presenting written proof reaffirmed that truth, however contested, still matters. It did not end the shutdown. It did not resolve the impeachment threat, but it reintroduced into the public lexicon the radical idea that democracy demands evidence, and that, sometimes, the loudest statement a lawmaker can make is not a shout, but a document held up to the light. In the aftermath of the shouting matches and televised confrontations, the political tension that erupted on Capitol Hill over the government shutdown was no longer about temporary funding bills or procedural gridlocks. It evolved into a deeper constitutional conversation, an unspoken reckoning about integrity, intellectual honesty, and the limits of political power. The exchange between Hakeem Jeffries and Mike Lawler, and later between Mike Johnson, Mark Kelly, and Ruben Gallego, did more than capture a single day's outrage. It exposed a growing fracture in how American lawmakers interpret the purpose and permanence of the Constitution itself. At the surface, the scene looked like another episode of partisanship gone theatrical: loud voices, personal jabs, and sound bites crafted for viral replay. Yet beneath that noise, there was something far more consequential taking shape. The disputes over the Affordable Care Act extension and the delayed swearing-in of Rep-elect Adelita Grijalva represented competing visions of governance, one driven by pragmatic continuity, the other by ideological control. Jeffries's curt dismissal, "Shut your mouth," might have sounded like a flash of temper, but it symbolized the exhaustion of a constitutional order strained by performative obstruction and the manipulation of procedural norms. From a legal perspective, these confrontations revived questions that scholars have debated for decades. What happens when elected officials weaponize process over principle? How does constitutional stability survive in an environment where loyalty to personality supersedes fidelity to law? The founders designed checks and balances not merely to prevent tyranny, but to enforce dialogue, an exchange of ideas grounded in facts, not theater. When Jeffries accused Lawler of turning governance into a spectacle, he was echoing the same anxiety that constitutional jurists have voiced since the early 20th century. The fear that political performance might eclipse substantive deliberation. The brought the receipts moment when lawmakers cited specific budgetary provisions, past Supreme Court decisions, and congressional precedents was not about showing who could shout louder, but about reclaiming the lost art of evidence in political debate. By producing written proof, documents, and previous legislative records, the participants sought to anchor their claims in something more enduring than partisan spin. This insistence on documentation became a symbolic counterweight to the era of misinformation. It reminded the public that in a democracy built on law, every argument must be traceable, every claim must be accountable. Over time, analysts began to notice a ripple effect. The confrontation over the government shutdown did not just end when the lights came back on. It reshaped how citizens viewed their representatives. Public approval for the Voting Rights Bill, which had previously struggled to gain momentum, began to rise. Voters who had grown numb to partisan theatrics started paying attention to the underlying legal questions. Who decides how rights are protected? Who interprets constitutional limits when partisanship distorts the process? The debate over healthcare and the budget became